Yo guys, welcome back to the channel and to this week's vlog. In this one, you will have seen the title is something along the lines of how to set up your training for success every time. And I think that's understated because I think sometimes people don't really set themselves up for success. And by this, I don't mean like a warm-up. I don't mean the kind of that entry into the gym. I mean that first week into like a training block. How do you set that week up so that every week thereon is super duper productive? Because I see a lot of people getting this wrong. So let me kind of run you through some examples. If you ever find yourself training and you get quickly very fatigued, as if you're hitting a wall, potentially you even see some regression, or you just see real stagnant like barely no progress basically, and you're very, very tired and you just found yourself needing to maybe deload sooner than you would like to. That's one scenario. Or another scenario is one where you just feel like you're not sure if you're pushing yourself hard enough, and you're just a bit kind of concerned that you've wasted a week of training potentially. This video is going to solve both of those today, as I'm going to set you up from that week one. I call it kind of a foundational week. If you get that right, it's going to set you up for the entire kind of mesocycle, that block of training that you're going to be doing. So how do we go about that? Background here, you're going to see my week one of my mini cut training right now, and hopefully you'll see some of the things that I'm talking about. So the first thing that I think you need to really make sure to get right is with your technique. I know everyone knows technique's important to some extent, right? But it's quite literally the foundation of which you build upon intensity, of which you build upon volume, and then progress those elements, right? If you do not have a good foundation of technique, then everything's going to collapse underneath. So two elements that I think are really important within technique and can actually be quite simple is one, control. People think about obviously tempo, and I like to think more about control. You don't want to have super duper slow eccentrics, because if you go too slowly, that's going to really hamper the amount of load you can use, and that might not be ideal. Up to 4 seconds or so is probably as slow as they will ever want to be, but not as quick as like one or no eccentric. So you want to have that eccentric under control. And then with your concentric, that essentially wants to be fairly explosive. You don't want to go real slow with it, but you don't want to rush it and be out of control. So this is why I just say lift with control. And then you can have things like pauses and elements like that, but ultimately lift with control. And then secondarily, the element of technique that I think is super underrated and people forget it all the time is standardize it. So if you have a certain tempo where you are potentially trying to go for a 3-second eccentric, don't let that decrease over the mesocycle, because now you're not actually progressing, you're just reducing your eccentric speed. And that's kind of making you feel like you're seeing progress. The same thing you can think about is range of motion. Standardize it. If you're coming down, touching your chest with the dumbbells for a dumbbell press, make sure you do that every rep, every set, every week. If you start reducing the range of motion, are you progressing or are you faking progress by shortening the range of motion? Those are the elements you want to standardize. Same with if you're pausing movements. If you're pausing for 1-2 counts at the bottom of a squat, don't suddenly stop pausing and start bouncing. You don't want to be doing that. Or with a barbell bent a row, easy one. Don't go adding momentum if you're kind of standardizing for control and the way you're lifting. Keep that pretty samey throughout. I say pretty because your technique might not look pretty in that kind of later down the line in the final week before you're deloading. You might breach technical failure in that. So it should look really quite pristine throughout the majority of the set, but as you're really pushing the intensity, your relative intensity, and you're getting close to failure, you might see your form like just break down a little bit for a rep or two, and then you know you've pushed your limits. Now you know you've actually definitely hit 0 reps in reserve, and in fact potentially gone past it. Depends how kind of much range you give yourself with technique. But that's the first thing to absolutely nail down, set the foundation with, is technique. Make sure it's controlled and make sure it's standardized, and you keep those components the same throughout the entire mesocycle. So the other thing we want to do in that first week of the mesocycle is meet thresholds for hypertrophy, for muscle growth, because that's what we're talking about here. So that means we want to meet this threshold, but we don't want to undershoot the threshold. Like I mentioned, you don't want to train too easy that you feel like, actually, I've sandbagged this week. I haven't done enough volume. I haven't done enough intensity. It's really just a week of, at best, maintenance. And you also don't want to overshoot this threshold so much that now you're so close to your maximum threshold where you can't go any more. You want to meet this threshold. And by thresholds, I mean there's basically 2 elements here. One is relative intensity. For the most part, around 2 to 4 RAR is a great place to start after like a deload. Now you're not pushing so close to failure that you're causing yourself a lot of unnecessary fatigue, but you're not starting so far away from failure that you're at risk of under like shooting in terms of relative intensity. I say 4 to 2 RAR for a few reasons. One is because I think compound lifts, you can afford to be a bit further away from failure and also benefit from being further away from failure because you're just going to get way more fatigue from being closer, and there's just no need because they're also likely heavier too. And you can likely afford to be further away from failure. For your isolation-based lifts, they can afford to potentially be as close as like, well, I mean, you can set up your mesocycle however you like, but the way I'm talking about it, I see 2 RAR is pretty damn fine. 2 RAR and isolation-based lifts, totally cool. They, in terms of the fatigue cost from being closer to failure, is much, much less. And also people tend to not push those as hard as they possibly could because it's actually really easy when you're not having to manage your whole body within space with a compound lift, for example. With an isolation based lift, you can be pretty locked in and push that real hard. So sometimes people undershoot the isolation based lift, so I think you can afford to be a little bit closer. But anywhere within this range, you don't need to be exactly 4, exactly 2. Somewhere within that range is a really good starting point where you know you're training hard, you're meeting the relative intensity overload thresholds, but you've got room to progress. This might look like your last rep or so slowing down in terms of concentric speed, and you can also experience just the feeling of, man, that was tough. You can also use your previous logbook data to indicate where you should be. If you know your 15 rep max for 100 on a squat is 100 for 15, you can be like, right, I want 4 reps in reserve. Let's take 4 reps off, do 100 for 11 reps or there or thereabouts. It can give you a starting point. And then this is kind of setting you up for that threshold in terms of relative intensity. And I talk about relative intensity because absolute doesn't matter so much. Finding anywhere between 5 and 30 repetitions is like a rep range that is going to be heavy enough in terms of the loads you would use to cause hypertrophy. I'd recommend sticking more towards 5 to 20 plus. It's probably something you want to use a bit more sparingly. It's also harder to gauge reps in reserve for such higher repetitions. But anyway, you'll probably find most of your training lands within like 8 to 15 reps or something because of the lifts you're choosing and what will feel best to you. But anyway, let's move on to the other element of the threshold. So we've got relative intensity, and then we've also got volume. So in terms of volume, that is number of sets. That's what we're going to be talking about here. And within the research, we find anywhere between 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, and that includes biceps within your pull movements, and it includes things like, let's think of another one, so like your triceps within pressing movements. It includes the overlap that you get from compound lifts, so don't suddenly do like crazy sets for your isolation lifts. They probably need far less than your big compound lifts for the main muscle groups. Anywhere from 10 to 20. Obviously, that's a wide range. You've got to think about yourself in this situation, but you probably don't want to be too far from around 10 sets for your first week. That's kind of trying to meet your volume threshold for growth. And really what we're trying to achieve here, we're trying to meet stimulus thresholds. We're trying to create enough stimulus in that first week for growth where you feel like you've done a good workout, you've created some disruption within that muscle, it's overloading, it was tough, but you have more in the tank, so you can progress that stimulus in future weeks. You can progressively overload. And so some biofeedback in combination with this volume, where you're trying to meet minimum effective volume essentially, and you're trying to meet this 4 to 2 RAR in terms of relative intensity, the biofeedback you can use, which are concepts that are probably less scientifically, they hold less scientific rigor. They're maybe more bro-ish, but I find to be very helpful for you auto-regulating your training, are things that I would call stimulus. And you're trying to meet this stimulus threshold, which is like you feel like you've gone into the gym and you've got maybe a between medium to low sense of, it could be a combination of pump, muscles full to bursting type of sensation. Arnie would love you. Then we've got things like disruption. So how tight does that muscle feel? Like that perturbation type of feeling. It maybe is quivering within the session. And then you have something like metabolites. So how kind of much of a burn are you getting within that muscle? Like what's that overall overarching stimulus that you're feeling? Within a week one, what I would call that kind of minimum effective stimulus. You're looking for like on a scale of minimal to high, we're looking for a low to medium in that week, where you leave the session where you're like, I did push my triceps, my chest, I've got a bit of a pump, they feel a bit tired, like if I push against here, my chest is quivering a little bit. Maybe the next day you're marginally sore, possibly not at all, but probably a little bit fatigued, but it recovers relatively quickly, certainly for your next session. We want to avoid minimal, where you walk out the gym and you're like, I don't know what muscle group I trained. If you left the gym and someone asked you like, and you didn't know, you wouldn't be able to identify. You also don't want to leave the gym like, dude, I am screwed. I don't know how I'm going to survive another session. You want to kind of just meet this like efficacious like threshold for growth, and thereon you can then progress that. So that's kind of the thing we're looking at here, is meeting that kind of minimum effective stimulus, that overload threshold for hypertrophy. So now when you have this base where you've standardized your technique and it's great, you've also met the thresholds for hypertrophy, we can now make things harder. We can progressively overload. And that is going to be, for most intents and purposes, adding a rep or a small amount of load. That might be 2 to 3% additional load or an extra rep. You will probably find that your reps in reserve will drop by 1 or something along those lines. But you don't need to be too concerned, because you're getting closer to failure because you already started close. And then you can just progress these variables. One important thing I want to make sure that you don't do is progress via load or reps at the expense of technique. You want to maintain good technique within a range. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just wants to be like a good technique. You don't want to start, like I said, shortening your range of motion, introducing momentum and things like this. You want to maintain that quality base. And then every week you're going to be able to progress like this until you can't. And then when you can't, you deload, you recycle, So hopefully this has set you up and you understand now how to get a solid foundation for training. And you can use this information to set up your clients or whoever. And this hopefully has given you some insights into that. And also seeing some of my training in the background hopefully has given you some like visual ideas of how that might look on various lifts. And if you are still struggling with that, if you would like some help with that, just remember, at Revive Stronger, coaching people through this sort of thing is exactly what we do. So if you'd like to book a call, remember, we've always got the link in the bio where you can do that. Otherwise, I'll leave this here. And as always, thank you guys for all your support, all the comments. If you aren't subscribed to the channel already, please do subscribe. And I guess I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.